All right, I left off in the last video talking about how schemas are functional, and we very literally would not be able to survive without them. We, as human beings, our usefulness is kind of limited to our social affiliation capabilities and how we can think and cooperate. Like compared to other animals, we are very squishy and weak, and we would not have survived as long as we could without being able to think in ways automatic like schemas. However, we also need to avoid always following those schemas because they might mislead us. And I mentioned a few things about how that might influence, say, perceptions of different racial groups, but I want to dig a little bit more into how that happens in a process that you've probably heard of before called the self-fulfilling prophecy. And that can be a kind of general idea, but I'm going to talk about it in a very specific way for our purposes. So, this is a cycle in which people have expectations about targets. Like, let's call a perceiver you and a target like a member of any particular group. So, you have an expectation about someone from X social group. You have a schema that tells you something about them from, whatever source, direct experience, hearing from other people, media, culture, whatever, you have this expectation. When you perceive the behavior of someone from a particular social group, you are experiencing it through this biased lens of expectation. You have expectations, and your perceptions mold whatever you're seeing very often to fit into those expectations. And this process is called perceptual confirmation. The next process where you are, then acting in a way toward this target. You act according to your biased perception, and your target is going to obviously pick up on the behavior that you are giving to them, and they are going to continue to act in a way that's consistent with the behaviors that they are getting very frequently. This is called behavioral confirmation. And that behavioral confirmation, it means the behaviors that you are eliciting from that target that they're giving to you that's in line with that idea further reinforce your expectations about the target. So we have perceptual confirmation that we are seeing things according to how we want to see them. And we have behavioral confirmation that our perceptions and behavior of other groups are leading them to behave in ways that we expect, further reinforcing that schema that we have about that particular target or group. One example of this that I'll use, I've already talked about how this happens with, disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups in the last video, but I'll mention another, less macro type of example. Let's say you meet a person that you are interested in romantically, and you have, for whatever reason, an expectation that that person is interested in you. Maybe it's because they, were polite to you sometime or something. Whether you're correct or not, it doesn't matter in this situation, but you have this expectation that someone is interested in you. So then you engage with this person and they smile at you, let's say. And, that is a normal, polite human being sort of thing to do, but you might interpret that smile or that small gesture of kindness as perceptual confirmation. Yes, they are into me. Excellent. Going swimmingly. Then you are going to act toward that person in a particular way because you still have this idea that they are interested in you. So you approach them and are, outgoing and forward and nice to them because you think they like you and they've shown you that, you believe, with that smile. So you make polite conversation, and that other person is nice to you back. And that perceptual confirmation that behavioral confirmation that they are acting in accordance with your expectations there further reinforces your idea that they are into you. So there are certainly entire relationships in the world that are completely predicated on maybe a false assumption that someone is into you that ends up actually eliciting behavior consistent with that they are actually interested in you. Or other times it could possibly go very wrong for you. You think someone's into you, you misinterpret their small actions, you do something to elicit behavior that brings out even more polite actions from that person, and you falsely think that they're into you, setting yourself up potentially for disappointment later on. But this cycle, it's not just in our heads. It is in our heads because it is perceptual in nature, but it affects things that are actually happening in the real world through this behavioral confirmation process and how we treat other people. One early example of a study that looked at this by a researcher named Mark Snyder and some of his colleagues at the University of Minnesota. I actually had the good fortune of taking some classes and working a bit with Mark when I was at Minnesota. So I'd like to talk about this cool study that he did in the 70s, where he had people engage in these kind of informal first impression sorts of conversations over the phone. And he was trying to elicit these different positive or negative expectations, like in step one of that process, by giving people photos of their partners. But these people actually didn't see the partners they were talking to on the phone. And then they had people rate how these conversations went and how the people acted. What they were really looking at is this general idea. We have, a trait schema about people that are physically attractive. We believe implicitly that people that are physically attractive are more intelligent, more competent, more capable, more engaging, more outgoing, all these different positive things we just tend to associate with physical attractiveness. So what they were manipulating here was, did the participants see the photo of an attractive person or an unattractive person? And for consistency's sake, and because this was, being carried out in the 70s and they maybe didn't think about whether they should balance this out, the perceivers in these studies were all men, and the people who they were shown photographs of were all women. So it's all male participants talking on the phone to women that are also participants, but the men believe that they are either attractive or unattractive, and it's just randomly assigned pictures of the women. The women don't see any pictures of the men, and they don't know what pictures are being shown of them. They don't know there's a picture at all. So they engage in this conversation, and what happens is the man thinks that they are talking to an attractive or unattractive woman. They are interpreting the behavior of the woman as confirming that stereotype. The women are just acting how they act. They don't know anything about the picture, but the men are interpreting it as though, oh, this is an engaging person, or this is kind of a boring person. And because the men have, interpreted that information in the way that they will, they then treat the women in a particular way. They treat them better and are more engaged themselves if they believe they're talking to someone who is attractive and therefore an engaging, nice person. And they tend to clam up a little bit or not try to get the conversation going as much if they believe the person is less attractive and therefore, according to our schemas, less engaging and less outgoing. So this was a pretty robust effect that they found. And when they looked, sorry, I'm flipping back and forth here, they looked at the trained observers' ratings who didn't know anything about the pictures at the time. And they rated that not only did the men enjoy the conversations better and were they more engaged because of what they saw, but the women, the behavioral confirmation part of this, the women actually behaved differently too. Women that had attractive pictures associated with them, they seemed more interested, and they were more outgoing in the conversations than the women who had unattractive pictures shown. So the men's expectations that they formed on the basis of a single picture about each of the women influenced how the women behaved, even though the women didn't even know that this expectation was there. So like what I say about this being real and not just being in your heads, the way that we represent the world guides our behavior, and that in turn guides and influences other people's behavior. The social world is not only in our heads, it's something that we all interact with and influence each other on. So this kind of way that behavioral confirmation again happens, schemas, they guide our expectations about people. They influence how we behave toward other people. And those behaviors that we engage in elicit other behaviors that fit into our schemas about those people. So we actually create social reality from the beliefs that we have about people and situations. It's not just in our heads. Another type of automatic thinking that I usually talk about at this point in the class is a little bit different, switching gears from schemas, thinking about the quick decisions that you make all the time, what you had for dinner, what you're going to wear, what you buy at the grocery store, the likelihood that something good or bad is going to happen to you. These are a little bit different from schemas. These are things called heuristics. These are mental shortcuts that we use all the time. So heuristics, again, mental shortcuts used to make these quick and efficient types of judgments. Sorry if you can hear that again, noisiness upstairs. Um, so I talked earlier about schemas addressing cognitive content. Heuristics then are cognitive processes. They're a little bit different. They're how that content fits together and how we use it to make decisions in quick, easy, unintentional, and ways that don't consume resources very much. So when we get to our synchronous session, or perhaps whenever you're watching this, if you've already had our synchronous session, we will have talked about heuristics a bit, and I will have demonstrated, polling all of you, how these things tend to happen. And we'll talk about, excuse me, a few different types of heuristics: availability, representativeness, and anchoring and adjustment. Although those are not, again, the only heuristics, just like I didn't list every type of schema in the world. Okay, so for the most part here, I introduced this distinction between automatic and controlled processing at the beginning, and then we really only talked about automatic processing, right? So how do we actually shift into controlled processing, into systematic, intentional, effortful types of thinking? So when and how do people actually do it? And there are, as there is kind of often in this class, sort of two conditions that lead to that outcome, that lead to controlled processing. When people have the ability and the motivation to engage in controlled processing, they're more likely to do it. By ability, I mean the resources, like mental resources to do something. So if you are intelligent enough and you're not distracted and you're not tired, you have that mental power to engage in that processing. Motivation, I mean like the drive, the interest, the investment to actually care about that topic or subject and actually go about and do it. Both of these things can come from our like kind of intrinsic natures, or they can come from circumstances put upon us. So factors that impact ability, this again, as you know, it's been true over and over again, are not exhaustive lists. I just want to give you a couple examples from inside and outside of the person. The first one I'll mention for an internal factor that impacts ability, personal cognitive ability, like intelligence or greater working memory. If you're smarter and if you can manipulate things in your mind better, then you are going to be more able in general to engage in controlled processing. A couple of examples of external determinants of ability are time pressure or distraction. If you don't have the time to do something because you have just a time limit or you're rushing, you're going to be less likely to be able to think about something. And if you're distracted and your attention is divided, then you will be less likely to be able to engage in careful processing. As far as motivation, again, not an exhaustive list, but need for cognition is an individual difference variable that just basically has to do with how much do you like thinking. Like questions on it are, I like to think about things just for fun, or I like to do puzzles and things like that. So people that are higher in need for cognition are in general going to be more motivated to think about anything and think hard about it rather than rely on automatic processing. But there are also lots of external factors like how much responsibility you have for something. If you are like a project leader versus somebody just working on something, you might be more motivated to think about it carefully if you're that leader. Personal relevance, maybe if it affects you or somebody that you love or care about, you might be more likely to engage in effortful processing. One classic study that I always like to mention is people manipulated how much tuition increases mattered to people. So they brought students into the lab, all seniors, and told them, hey, we're going to increase tuition. And they either told them it's going to be next semester when you're still here and it's going to affect you, or it's going to be in 4 years when you're gone. And people thought much more carefully about the merits of the argument for tuition increases when it was going to affect them. When it wasn't going to affect them, then, well, who cares? Yeah, sure, whatever, increase tuition. But personal relevance determined that level of motivation. And then finally, just how important it is. If it's what you're deciding for lunch versus like a healthcare directive for a loved one, these are very different levels of importance, right? So you're going to be more engaged in care and what's going on if it is a more important sort of decision. So I just want to wrap up just by mentioning that I think a lot of times we might think about automatic processing as worse in some ways, especially after we talk about the heuristics, you might think, because we'll kind of focus on the errors that people tend to make there. That automatic processing is worse and controlled processing is better. But that's not really true, because we need both of those things. And it's always a trade off between the two. So controlled processing, yeah, it's more intentional. There's more control you have. It happens to be more accurate a lot of the time, but it's time consuming and uses up our mental resources, which are not infinite. We can't give all of our attention to everything, or we would be paralyzed constantly because there's too much information in our social worlds. Just walking down the street or going to the store or trying to do an assignment, there's too much to try to figure out, and you need to make those types of automatic decisions. So automatic processing, it allows us to navigate our world because we can't pay attention to everything. And sometimes it's even more accurate. But that automatic processing that makes it possible for us to survive and be functional human beings also leads to certain types of errors like overgeneralizations and judging people in ways that are unfair. Again, this is going to inform a lot of what we talk about going forward, from attitudes and social perception to pro-social behavior and relationships and stereotypes and prejudice. So keep all these things in mind and the trade-offs and differences between controlled and automatic processing as we move forward.